Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Betrayal, ambition, or simple need. Discover the story of Juan Sin Tierra, the king who sold his kingdom by gold. What price did you pay for your decision? Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. Imagine, for a moment, the reign of Enrique II, a man who expanded English as few, a relentless legislator who left an indelible mark on the judicial system. His reign, a time of consolidation and reforms, laid the foundations for what would come later. Pero su legado, tan salido como parecía, ese viria amenazado por las ambiciones y las traiciones de sus propios hijos, incluyendo a ese personaje que hoy nos ocupa. Juan Sin Tierra. Enrique II not only left a more extensive kingdom, but also a more efficient legal system. His masterpiece, the Assizes of Clarendon, reformed English justice, establishing a system of itinerant courts that crossed the country, taking the law to all corners of the kingdom. This advance in the administration of justice contrasted with the instability that its heirs would cause. But Enrique II's greatness was also overshadowed by his family conflicts. Their children, in their struggle for power, faced each other and against their father, sowing the seeds of discord that would eventually tear the kingdom. This fratricidal rivalry, fed by excessive ambitions and lack of loyalty, laid the perfect scenario for the betrayal of Juan Sin Tierra. But Enrique II's greatness did not guarantee peace in his own family. His youngest son, Juan, was different. While his older brothers dedicated themselves to political intrigues and wars, Juan, with his impulsive character and his thirst for power, a reputation as a rebel, was worked from a young age. He showed a fascination with luxury and opulence, a marked contrast with the austerity of his father. The rivalry with his older brothers, especially Ricardo Hart of Leon, deeply marked his youth. Ricardo, the heir, was all that Juan was not, a brave and charismatic warrior. This rivalry, fed by Juan's ambition and the preference of Enrique II by Ricardo, sowed the seeds of the future betrayal. His constant conflicts with his royal family, and his lack of discipline, were an open secret in court. Despite his rebellion, Juan was intelligent and cunning that I knew how to manipulate people and get what they wanted, even through dishonest media. His lack of scruples allowed him to weave a network of alliances, using his superficial charm to gain the confidence of those who could help him in their ambitions. This ability to political intrigue, although even in its beginnings, would become its most powerful weapon in the future. But Juan, avid of power and land, did not settle for the inheritance that corresponded to him. He envied the influence of his older brothers, Ricardo Hart of Leon and Geoffrey. His ambition pushed him to conspire against his own father, Enrique II, looking for alliances with the king's enemies and promising territories and favors in exchange for his support. The civil war broke out, brothers facing brothers in bloody battlefields. Ricardo, the brave and charismatic heir, led his father's loyal forces, while Juan, with his allies, challenged the power of the crown. You can imagine the brutal bloodshed and the betrayal that marked this family struggle. Beamed castles, flamed cities, and the constant sound of swords colliding. The English nobility was divided, choosing side in a fratricidal struggle that devastated the kingdom. You are a witness to the cruelty of a war that did not know limits, where loyalty and betrayal were intertwined in a mortal dance. Thus, Juan, plotting in the shadows, warned a conspiracy against Ricardo. Taking advantage of the absence of the king, loyal to his crusades, Juan sowed discord among the nobles, promising land and favors in exchange for his loyalty. Te imaginas la tensión palacega, las intrigas susuradas en los corredores, las alianzas que se tejían y deshaían con la velocidad del viento? Ricardo's death, in circumstances still debated today, opened the way for Juan. Although some suspected their involvement, the lack of direct evidence allowed him to claim the throne. But his ascent was not peaceful. His brother Arturo, the legitimate heir according to many, challenged his authority, feeding a civil war that would bloody the kingdom. The battles were bloody, full of blood and betrayal. Juan, with his army, crushed Arturo's rebellion, demonstrating ruthless cruelty. The war left behind a trace of death and destruction, consolidating John's reign, but at a terrible price. Remember that the road to power is often paved with pain and suffering. /prosody, /speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%, but Juan's ambition had a price. His unfulfilled promises and his tyrannical government enraged the English barons. They had supported their ascent to the throne, trusting their word, but they found themselves betrayed. Fiscal oppression, land usurpation, and contempt for their ancestral rights had sown the seed of the rebellion. They felt that their loyalty had been vilely rewarded with tyranny. Fed up with real arbitrariness, the nobles joined Juan. They demanded a change, a break to the absolute power of the king. In Runnymede, a green field next to the Thames, faced the king, willing to fight for his rights. They did not look for a war, but justice. They sought a guarantee that they would never be treated with such little respect. The result was the Magna Carta, a historical document that limited the king's power for the first time in the history of England. It was not perfect, but it represented a gigantic step towards freedom and self-government. You can imagine the tension, fear, and hope that those men have to feel by challenging the king and writing the foundations of a more fair future. But the fury of the barons was not the only threat to Juan. His relationship with the church was at a critical point. He, in need of money for his wars and extravagances, had imposed strong taxes on the clergy, something that Pope Innocent III was not willing to tolerate. The church, with its immense wealth and power, was a force to take into account, and challenge it was to play with fire. You will see how this confrontation would add more firewood to the fire of the rebellion. The Pope, with his moral and political authority, excommunicated John, a devastating blow to a king who depended on the support of the church. The excommunication meant that John was out of God's grace and that his subjects were not obliged to obey him. Imagine the situation. A king faced with the wrath of his barons and now also to the power of the church. It was an almost desperate situation, right? To make things worse, the Pope threatened to invade England, openly supporting the rebel barons. Juan, cornered, was forced to take desperate measures. The pressure was immense, and the conflict with the church became a key piece in its fall. You can understand the magnitude of the problem when a king faces the internal rebellion and the threat of a papal invasion. But the pressure by gold was not limited to the coffers of the church. For Juan, the French lands represented an obsession, a source of power and wealth that refused to release. Remember that, despite being King of England, he had extensive possessions in France, a family legacy that he saw as a divine right, a treasure that had to recover and expand at any cost. His ambition had become an insatiable maelstrom, driven by the need to demonstrate his value and power. These lands were not only a status symbol, but a strategic asset. Controlling those regions, one could challenge the powerful French counts and increase their influence on the French court. The idea of a territorial expansion in France obsessed him. He imagined expanding his domains, consolidating his power, and leaving a legacy that eclipsed his ancestors. But this blind ambition would lead to a series of wrong decisions. The loss of Normandy, in particular, was a thorn nailed in his heart. That territory belonged to him by inheritance right, or at least he believed. Recovering it became a priority, an obsession that pushed him to make risky decisions and spend exorbitant amounts of money, even resorting to unorthodox methods to finance his expensive campaigns. The need for gold for their wars in France became a vicious circle. Remember that, blinded by ambition, Juan Sin desperately needed money to finance his wars and maintain his power. The French king, Felipe Augusto, saw his chance. You imagine the scene. An English king humiliated, kneeling before his rival, signing a treaty that would strip him of much of his possessions. That was Chinon's Treaty, the first nail in the coffin of his reign. The treaty, signed in 1205, was a humiliation for Juan in exchange for a substantial sum of gold, City and Normandia, Anjou, Maine and Touraine, key territories for their power and identity. Think of what it meant for him. Losing those lands was to lose part of its essence, its family history, its legitimacy as king. It was an act of despair, a betrayal of his own legacy. But why did Juan accept those unfavorable conditions? The answer is simple: despair. His need for gold was so great that he blinded him to the long-term consequences. He sold his enemy to save his present, without considering the uncertain future he expected. That decision, taken in Chinon, marked the beginning of his fall, the way to his complete ruin. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. You imagine humiliation. Juan Sin, the King of England, had signed the Chinon Treaty, delivering a significant part of his possessions to Felipe Augusto. But the worst part was yet to come. Normandia, the heart of the Anglo-Normandy heritage, the territory that connected England with the continent, was at stake. It was a rich, strategically and symbolically powerful region. Losing it meant a devastating blow to its prestige and power. Felipe Augusto, with cunning and military force, began executing the treaty city by city. Castillo by Castillo, the Normans, many of them loyal to Juan, saw the French troops reach. The resistance was futile. The Norman, divided and weakened nobility by internal ambitions and betrayals, could not oppose an effective defense. The loss of Normandy was rapid and forceful, a symbol of the decline of the power of John without Earth. Imagine the impact. The loss of Normandy was not only a military defeat, but a blow to the pride and legitimacy of Juan. His position as king was seriously compromised. The English barons, observing their weakness, began to question their authority, feeding the tensions that would lead to even more dramatic events. The loss of Normandy marked the beginning of the end, the prelude to a loud fall for the king who sold his kingdom by gold. But what happened to that gold? Did it serve for something more than to fill your coffers? You could ask yourself if the excessive ambition of Juan Sin Tierra led him to make disastrous decisions. Even after the loss of Normandy, his fortune, needed through exorbitant taxes and confiscations, became a symbol of his tyranny, further feeding the discontent of his nobles and subjects. Imagine the scene. Gold mountains, brilliant in the light of the candles, but that brightness did not hide the corruption and injustice that surrounded it. The king, obsessed with material wealth, neglected his responsibilities as a ruler, losing the loyalty of his barons and leaving England vulnerable to intrigues and rebellions. That fortune, product of oppression and abuse of power, did not bring the stability or security that Juan Sin Tierra sought. On the contrary, it became a ballast, attracting greed and betrayal, while he clung to it with despair, blind to the consequences of his acts. The excessive ambition, like a slow poison, was consuming it. Well, that gold, product of his questionable methods, did not bring the stability that Juan Sin Earth expected. On the contrary, his greed unleashed a political storm. The English nobility, accustomed to certain privileges and exemptions, felt squeezed as lemon taxes, uploaded to unbearable levels to finance their ambitions, caused a generalized discontent. Imagine the situation. Powerful nobles, with own lands and armies, seeing how their wealth vanished in the royal coffers. The pressure on Juan Sin Tierra grew exponentially. The murmurs of rebellion became direct threats. The noble, powerful, and with influence on their vassals, saw in the situation an opportunity to recover what they considered their right. They were not willing to tolerate fiscal oppression indefinitely. You could imagine the tension in each encounter between the king and his barons, every word a spark that could light the fuse of a civil war. The situation became unsustainable. Gold, which promised security, became a source of conflict. The nobility, with its private armies and its influence, would not be trampled. The excessive ambition of Juan Sin Tierra, instead of strengthening his kingdom, was leading him to the edge of collapse. What decisions would you make in place? How would you try to placate the fury of the nobles? The answer, as you will see, would have devastating consequences. The drop that exceeded the glass was the new wool tax, the economic engine of England. You, as a spectator, can imagine the fury of the barons, who were already fed up with Juan's eccentricities. They felt that their rights were being trampled, that the king was behaving like a tyrant, and that the country's wealth was concentrating on the hands of a single man, leaving the impoverished and resentful nobility. The barons, powerful and with their own armies, did not stay with crossed arms. One by one, they began to join John, forming a powerful alliance, capable of challenging the author's authority. The threat of a civil war in England, a war that would not only put the throne at stake, but also the very future of the kingdom. You could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of an imminent battle. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The rebellion exploded. The barons, with their armies, marched over London, the capital of the kingdom. Juan, surprised by the speed and strength of the answer, was forced to negotiate. Remember that he has always depended on gold, but on this occasion, gold was not enough. The power of the united barons was immense, and the threat of a bloody war was too real to ignore it. You present the beginning of the end of Juan Sin Tierra reign. The humiliation suffered by Juan without land before the revolt of the barons did not go unnoticed by Felipe II of France. You, as a spectator, can imagine it. A weakened English king, plunged into an internal crisis, represented a golden opportunity for his territorial ambitions. Felipe, cunning and ambitious, saw in the situation of John an open door to expand its influence in England, a rich and strategic territory that had always wished to control. Felipe did not hesitate to offer his support to the English rebels, promising troops and resources in exchange for territorial concessions. For you, this support was not a simple sample of generosity, but a strategic investment. Felipe sought to weaken England, his main rival, and ensure a dominant position in the continent. Imagine secret diplomacy, negotiations in sections, and shadow-forged alliances. Felipe II's help was decisive. For you, it is easy to understand how the promise of a French army reinforced the position of the rebel barons, increasing their negotiating power and their ability to challenge the king. Juan without Earth, now facing a war on two fronts, was caught in a desperate situation, without sufficient strength to counteract the alliance between the English nobles and the powerful French king. So there was Juan, weakened but not defeated, looking for allies where he could find them. The humiliation before his barons had pushed him to an alliance risky with the powerful Felipe II of France. Together, they planned a blow against the English king, but his plans collided head-on with the ambition of the French king, who had his own sights on Flanders. You, as a witness of these events, could feel the tension in the air, the feeling of an epic battle about to explode. The Battle of Bouvines, in 1214, was the turning point. Imagine the scene. Two imposing armies colliding on a muddy battlefield. The roar of war, the steel clash against steel, the cry of men. Juan, confident in his alliance with Felipe, watched from the French lines. But the battle did not develop as he expected. The French strategy, so meticulously planned, began to crumble under the weight of English resistance. The English army, although to a lesser number, demonstrated an unexpected resistance. The English knights, with their imposing armor and their shining swords, faced the French cavalry. While you watched the battle from the rear, you would have seen the growing despair in Juan's face. The French defeat was becoming a reality, and with you, felt the weight of failure. The defeat in Bouvines was a devastating blow for Juan without Earth and for his ambitions. The alliance with Felipe II had failed loudly. The battle marked the end of his hopes of recovering the total control of England. For you, as a spectator, the result was a turning point, a crucial moment that marked the beginning of the end of his reign. But the alliance with Felipe II turned out to be a desperate commitment. You remember the Battle of Bouvines, right? The defeat was overwhelming. Juan, with his defeated and dispersed army, was forced to accept humiliating terms. His dream of a unified and powerful kingdom faded before his eyes, leaving behind a trace of betrayal and failure. The pressure of his barons, aggrieved by his constant betrayals and abuses of power, intensified. He was no longer simply a weak king, but a defeated and hated king. The English nobility, fed up with their whims and its disastrous military decisions, began to conspire openly against him. The end of his reign approached by leaps and bounds. Finally, in 1216, death surprised him. Not in the heat of battle, but weakened and sick, possibly poisoned. According to some rumors, his reign, marked by oppression and instability, came to an end. Juan without Earth, the king who sold his kingdom by gold, left behind a legacy of betrayal and desolation. His death opened a new chapter in the history of England, one where the struggle for the power and desire of a fairer monarchy would continue to define the future. Forced to negotiate, Juan sin Tierra was seen in front of the pressure of the English barons, fed up with his abuses and his constant wars. The defeat in Bouvines had weakened its position, leaving its vulnerability. The stage was ready for a change of power, a change that would be reflected in the Treaty of Lambeth. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. In Lambeth, near London. This treaty was signed in 1215. It was not a total surrender, but a significant concession by the king. Remember that English barons, tired of their arbitrariness and excesses, demanded a drastic change in the way of governing. The treaty limited real power, establishing the rights of the barons and the church. Although all points were not detailed at that time, the basis for the subsequent Magna Letter Saturday. Imagine the tension in the air, the uncertainty of whether this agreement would be lasting or just a truce before a new battle. Thus, humiliated and with the excommunication sword hanging on his head, Juan without Earth was forced to seek the help of Pope Innocent III after the defeat in Bouvines. The church represented its last hope. That I imagine John, in a cold and humid cell of the Vatican, begging the Supreme Pontiff to lift the excommunication and help him recover his power. Can you imagine the humiliation of such a powerful king? Kneeling before the Pope? The negotiations were long and complex. The Pope, cunning and powerful, demanded important concessions in exchange for his support. Not only was it about lifting excommunication, but also to guarantee the stability of the kingdom and obedience of John to the Church. It was a chess game between two giants, where each movement could mean triumph or ruin. Juan, accustomed to opulence and absolute power, had to swallow his pride and accept the conditions of the Pope. To renounce part of his authority, accept the influence of the Church on the affairs of the kingdom. It was a hard blow to his ego, but it was the price to pay for his political survival. Do you think he really regretted his actions or simply looking for a way out? Humiliated and with the urgent need to recover his power, Juan Sin Tierra understood that the only exit was a strategic marriage. He needed a powerful alliance, a queen who brought armies and wealth with him. But who would dare to marry an excommunicated king, a man stained by betrayal and defeat? The negotiations were arduous. Many princesses were considered, but their parents rejected the proposal. The stigma of excommunication was an almost impassable barrier. The reputation of Juan Sin Tierra preceded his proposal, turning each possible alliance into a risky bet. Finally, after months of desperate efforts, he found an option. An alliance that, although it was not ideal, could offer a break. A princess, perhaps not of the highest nobility, but with enough resources and a father willing to negotiate, despite the rumors surrounding the English king. So, there was Juan, believing to have found the solution to his problems. But what happened to the barons? You know, those feudal, powerful lords, and with a long memory like an English winter. They had seen how Juan had despised them, how he had ignored their advice, how he had trampled their rights, and now, with this marriage of convenience, they felt that their loyalty, their trust, was being trampled once again. The resentment, a slow fire, began to burn under the ashes of the apparent submission. The alliance with the new queen was not enough to calm its spirits. For them, Juan was still the same usurper, the same traitor who had broken his oaths and had played with his loyalty. The feeling of betrayal, the humiliation of having been ignored and treated as pawns in Juan's power game, had become a deep resentment, a culture broth for rebellion. Trust, that fragile base on which the kingdom was sustained, had shattered. Juan, blind for his ambition, had not realized the storm that was coming. That he had underestimated the power of collective resentment, the relentless force of the barons that, united by his anger, were willing to challenge him, to fight for what they considered their legitimate rights, even if that meant overthrowing the king who had failed them. So, the barons, fed up with Juan's impositions, rose. You imagine the scene. Besieged castles, flags waving in the wind, the clamor of weapons. But Juan, confident in his mercenary army, decided to face them. Lincoln's battle was about to begin. A confrontation that would define the future of England. The battlefield, a low dazzle after the spring rains, prepared the stage for a bloody fight. The battle was fierce. The English archers, with their arrows whistling through the air, sowed chaos between the enemy ranks. But the barons, despite being poorly equipped compared to the royal army, fought with a desperate ferocity, defending their lands and their rights. You could feel the tension, adrenaline, the smell of blood and sweat in the air. Prosody. Speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The battle lasted for hours, a whirlwind of steel and blood. Finally, Juan's cavalry, with a decisive load, broke the rebel lines. But despite the king's apparent victory, Lincoln's battle marked a turning point. Although Juan was victorious on the battlefield, the baronial rebellion did not extinguish. Its resistant seed had been deeply planted in the English floor, ready to germinate in new and more dangerous revolts. But the war had charged a high price, even for Juan. His resources were diminished, his exhausted armies. The barons, gathered in Runnymede, presented an ultimatum. Signing the Great Letter or facing an even more bloody war. You imagine the pressure, the despair of such a powerful king, now cornered, forced to give in to the will of his subjects. With Damocles' sword on his head, Juan had no choice but to sign. The Great Letter, a document that limited real power and guaranteed certain rights to the nobility, became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. It was a triumph for barons, but also a humiliation for the king. Can you imagine the impotence of signing something that stripped you of so much power? However, the signing of the Magna Carta was not the end of the story. Juan, although obliged, never really accepted the limitations imposed, that he sought ways to cancel the document, to recover the absolute power he believed corresponded to him by divine right. For him, the firm had been a forced concession, a truce in a war that, in his mind, was far from finishing. Do you think he really resigned himself to losing his power? But the signature of the Magna Carta did not bring peace. Juan, desperate to recover his power, gathered a new army. However, you already know that the loyalty of his men was questionable, to put it gently. Many of his barons, those who had humiliated him in Runnymede, expected the opportunity to betray him again, to change his side as soon as he allowed it. The distrust was palpable in the air, a spectrum that stalked every movement of the king. Lincoln's battle was the scene of this betrayal. While one struggled with courage, directing his troops, he watched with horror how part of his cavalry, men to whom he had trusted his life and his kingdom, retired from the battlefield without orders, leaving their companions exposed to the enemy attack. The disloyalty was shameless, a stab in the back in the very heart of the conflict. It was a betrayal that would seal its destiny. The defeat in Lincoln was inevitable. After this betrayal, he not only lost his battle, but lost confidence in his own men. The disloyalty of his barons was not a simple rebellion. It was a deep fracture in the very fabric of his kingdom. It was the final blow, the confirmation that his reign, built on oppression and distrust, was inevitably falling apart. The betrayal on the battlefield had been the death sentence of his reign. The signing of the Magna Letter was just a respite before the storm. Juan, humiliated, unleashed his fury about those he considered responsible for his weakness. Imagine besieged castles, burned villages, and the land soaked with innocent blood. His reign was not a succession of epic battles, but an implacable wave of violence that extended throughout the kingdom. You could have witnessed the terror that sowed in its path. Remember the nobles who dared to challenge him. Many were stripped of their lands, their castles turned into ruins, their families imprisoned or executed. Juan's cruelty did not know limits. He imposed exorbitant taxes, looted churches and monasteries, and turned the lives of his subjects into a constant nightmare. It was a terror that was not limited to the nobility. Common people suffered under the yoke of their tyranny. Taxes were unbearable, non-existent justice, and fear was the only ruler in the hearts of the men and women who lived under their reign. Hunger and diseases were primed in a population devastated by war and oppression. You will ask how a king could reach such extremes. The answer, my friend, is in the very nature of his excessive ambition and his insatiable thirst for power. The opulence of the court of Juan contrasted brutally with the misery of the people. While he surrounded himself with luxury, his subjects starved in hunger in villages devastated by war and abusive taxes. You saw how the king, blinded by his own ambition, moved away from the reality of his kingdom, building an insurmountable abyss between his crown and his people. The popular anger was under the surface, contained by the fear of real retaliation. But discontent grew with every day that passed, with each new tax, with each new act of cruelty. You could feel the tension in the environment, the spark about to turn on an unstoppable flame of rebellion. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. The Great Letter, that document that promised justice and balance, had become a simple piece of parchment, ignored by the king and his nobles. For you, it was evident that the gap between the crown and the town was too deep, an abyss that threatened to swallow the entire kingdom, leaving behind ruins and ashes. But Juan's opulence could not buy the loyalty of his people. The outrage grew with every day that passed, and the famine became a silent ally of rebellion. In fields, peasants armed with tillage tools and immense fury, they began to organize resistance against the traitor king. Castillo after Castillo, a symbol of Juan's power, became the objective of this growing wave of challenge. You will see how the nobles, tired of real greed, changed their loyalty, joining the rebellion. The castles, once impregnable, fell after the other before the combined force of popular despair and the discontent of the nobility. The legends of heroism and courage were born in those fierce fighting days. Long and bloody sieges, night assaults, and the reconquest of lost lands were every day's bread. The echo of the battles resonated throughout the kingdom, while every victory of the resistance further weakened the power of Juan without earth. The fall of each castle was a direct blow to the heart of his reign. a symbol of his failure and the united force of a people who decided to fight for his freedom. His riches, before source of pride, became a ballast that dragged him towards ruin. The gold that so longed for could not buy the loyalty or life of those who rebelled against him. The famine hit hard. You saw how the peasants, with the emaciated faces and the lost look, rose against the king. They were not just noble and gentlemen who rebelled. They were the ones who cultivated the earth, those who fed the kingdom, those who now died of hunger while Juan Sin Tierra roamed in their wealth. His complaints, formerly whispering, had become a deaf roar, a clamor that rumbled in the valleys. In the villages, the bonfires burned with an intensity that was not just because of the cold. They were the symbols of the resistance, of a flame that refused to extinguish. The villagers, organized in small militias, prepared to defend their homes and their families. They had gone from submission to rebellion, from resignation to the struggle, desperate for survival. His weapons were rough, his small armies, but his determination was unwavering. You were witnessing a deep change. Patience had exhausted. The town, tired of tyranny and hunger, had risen. They did not ask for wealth or privileges, only justice and the right to survive. His war cry echoed through the fields, a challenge to the crown that threatened to shake the foundations of the kingdom. The popular rebellion was an unstoppable tsunami. The rebellion had hit you strongly. The screams of the peasants, the creak of weapons, the image of your kingdom falling apart. You were in a difficult position. Gold that you longed for, now seemed a curse. You had sent emissaries, offering concessions, trying to appease the fury of your people. But distrust was deep, too deep. You remembered the words of the directors, their warnings about the wrath of the people. Would you have been able to avoid it? The question tormented you. You had underestimated the power of faith, the weight of tradition, the love of people for their land. Repentance, a new and painful feeling, began to etch your soul. The nights were long and full of nightmares. You promised changes, justice, a fairer government. You offered land, tax exemption, the release of political prisoners. But your words, once so safe, now sounded hollow, even for you. People looked at you with distrust. How to recover your trust after so much damage? The task seemed titanic, almost impossible. The gold that had promised you salvation had betrayed you. Your allies, bought with that same gold, abandoned you when you needed them. The disease consumed you, a slow and painful drip that reflected the decay of your kingdom. The castle, once a symbol of power, was now your prison, a mute witness of your agony. The days became a succession of nightmares, physical pain mixed with the bitterness of defeat. You remembered the lost battles, the betrayals suffered, the weight of a crown that no longer belonged to you. Death approached, cold and relentless, as a silent enemy that watched you from darkness. Finally, the day came when your heart stopped beating. Death freed you from your suffering, but your legacy was written with treason and blood ink. Your reign, marked by greed and cruelty, became a warning for the monarchs that happened to you, an example of how the excessive craving for power and wealth can lead to total ruin. Prosody, speak. Speak, a prosody rate equals 90%. Death came to you like a whisper at night, wrapped in the fog of uncertainty. Disease, some said, a slow agony that took your body weakened by excesses and wars. But others murmured as a poison, of a final betrayal, even more cruel than that of your allies. Was it a subtle potion, managed by enemy hands, which turned off your flame, or simply the culmination of a reign marked by unbridled ambition? The story, as always, resists giving definitive answers. Chroniclers, influenced by the different political factions of the time, offer contradictory versions. Some paint an image of a king consumed by the dysentery, others point to a carefully orchestrated plot, and poisoned end for the monarch who sold his kingdom for a handful of coins. The suspicions fall on many, your enemies, of course, but also those who surrounded you, those to whom you had rewarded with gold, those who perhaps tired of your tyranny and sought an end to your reign, a faster end than the slow deterioration that it consumed you. The truth hides after the veil of the centuries, remains in mystery, an enigma as fascinating as your own life. But your death, won without earth, did not bring peace. Your reign, a succession of wars and betrayals, left behind a destroyed kingdom. The castles, once symbols of power, now showed the scars of the sieges, their stones worn by time and war. The field, formerly fertile and productive, lay grass, devastated by the constant battles and instability that you sowed. The cities, once vibrant commerce centers, were in ruins, their silent markets and their deserted streets. People, decimated by war and hunger, wandered aimlessly, looking for an unlikely shelter in a kingdom plunged into despair. The gold that you longed for, the gold for which you sold your kingdom, could not buy you neither the peace nor the loyalty of your own people. Your legacy is not that of a wise and powerful king, but that of a ruler who bled his own kingdom in pursuit of an excessive ambition. The cost of your greed was the suffering of your people, a too high price that was charged in lives, in devastated lands and in an uncertain future. The seed of discord that you sowed would take a long time to be eradicated. But among the ashes of your reign, Juan, something unexpected emerged. The great letter signed in Runnymede in 1215, under pressure from the rebel barons. This document, although imperfect and with clauses that were later modified or ignored, marked a milestone. For the first time, it was tried to limit the absolute power of the monarch, establishing basic rights for the nobles, although initially excluding the majority of the population. Although initially benefited mainly to the nobility, the Great Letter planted the seed of a revolutionary concept. The idea that the king's power was not unlimited, but subject to certain laws and restrictions. This was a radical idea for the time, a first step towards the limitation of arbitrary power and the protection of certain individual rights, laying the basis for the development of the rule of law. Over the centuries, the Great Letter became a symbol of freedom and justice, inspiring movements for political reform and the protection of human rights. Its influence extends to this day, serving as a fundamental historical reference in the fight against tyranny and the defense of individual rights. Although its initial application was limited, its legacy is undeniable. The signature of the Magna Carta was not the end of your problems. Juan, your kingdom, already weakened by your ambitions and your constant wars, crumbled. The barons, although momentarily calm, were still distrustful. The English nobility, fed up with your abuse of power and exorbitant taxes, looked at you suspicious, waiting for the next opportunity to rebel again. The real treasure, dilapidated by your extravagances and your failed military campaigns, was practically empty. The real coffers were empty, leaving your kingdom without resources to face the inevitable crises. People suffered hunger and disease, while you clung to your power, more and more isolated and feared. Popular discontent grew to become a real threat. The peasant revolts extended throughout the kingdom, feeding chaos and insecurity. The feudal lords, taking advantage of the weakness of your government, faced each other in a struggle for power, leaving the kingdom in anarchy. Your reign, once a symbol of power, had become synonymous with ruin. Remember Juan sin Tierra, his excessive ambition, that insatiable thirst for power that led him to face his own barons, was his downfall. He was not a man of half-inks. He acted with a brutality that made him fearsome, but also despicable. His lack of scruples, his ability to betray his closest allies, made him a hated and feared king in the same extent that lack of loyalty. Was it a weakness or a calculated strategy? Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. It was impulsive, yes, but also cunning. His intelligence was undeniable, although he used it for his own purposes, regardless of the cost. NATO manipulator, wove a network of alliances and betrayals that allowed him, at least for a while, maintain control. However, that same intelligence, combined with his lack of empathy, led him to underestimate his enemies and make fatal mistakes. His arrogance, his belief in his own invulnerability, blinded him before the warning signals. His contradictory personality, an explosive mixture of intelligence, excessive ambition, and cruelty, made him a fascinating character, but also terrible. To a king who could be ruthless in a moment and cunning in the next, a man capable of great acts of violence, but also of moments of apparent calm, who only served to hide his true nature. Was your personality the sole responsible for your fall, or did other factors play other crucial paper? But was Juan without Earth really as evil as history paints it? You could ask yourself if the image we have of him is fair, or if, on the contrary, he has been the victim of a defamation campaign orchestrated by his enemies. Remember that the story is written by the victors, and many of those who accused him had reasons to do so, seeking to justify their own ambitions and actions. The chronicles of the time, often written by partial chroniclers, present it as a ruthless tyrant, an unscrupulous traitor. However, if we analyze in more detail, we will find nuances. His reign was marked by constant conflicts, civil wars, and the constant pressure of English barons, anxious to snatch power. It was a difficult context, which perhaps did not give him the opportunity to show his true potential. Perhaps, instead of a pure and simple villain, Juan Sin Tierra was a king with defects, caught in a complex network of political intrigues and power struggles. A man who made mistakes, without a doubt, but who was also forced to make difficult decisions in an extremely hostile context. Was it a cruel king? Yes, in many ways, but it was also a product of his time, a man who fought to survive in a brutal world. But how does Juan without land compare with other kings of his time? Unlike kings such as Ricardo Hart of Leon, his brother, famous for his crusades and courage, Juan was characterized by his lack of charisma and his inability to maintain the unity of the kingdom. While Ricardo inspired loyalty, Juan caused constant rebellions, weakening England internally and leaving the country vulnerable to external threats. Think about the difference in impact that both had on history. In contrast to the French kings of the time, who consolidated their power through strategic alliances and territorial conquests, Juan was involved in constant conflicts and lost key territories. His reign was marked by failure, unlike the military and political successes of his contemporaries. Imagine the difference in legacy, stability versus perpetual chaos. Even comparing it with kings considered less successful, Juan stands out for his inefficiency. While other kings could have had their failures, but they managed to leave some positive brand in history, Juan's legacy is mainly reduced to the loss of territories, the oppression of their subjects, and the signing of the Magna Letter, a document started by force, more than a voluntary concession. Do you think this defines its place in history? Unlike Ricardo, for John, gold did not represent the glory of the crusade, but the immediate tangible power. Each coin was another soldier, an impregnable castle, a vote of loyalty bought. You might think it was a pragmatic vision, right? But in his obsession to accumulate it, wasn't something more important lost? Wasn't genuine loyalty lost, respect for his people? Gold, that bright metal, became his prison. Each new piece tied it more to its ambition, moving away from the true essence of leadership. The incessant search for wealth blinded him to the needs of his kingdom, before the consequences of his actions. It became a king who, paradoxically, was surrounded by wealth but mired in the solitude of distrust. Think about it. What is more, a united kingdom for justice or a treasure that only attracts greed? Juan Sin Land chose gold, and that gold, ultimately, became the cause of his ruin. His reign, marked by greed, leaves us a lesson. True wealth is not measured in ounces of gold, but in the well-being of your people and in the strength of your legacy. What do you think? So what was the result of this gold obsession? For you, the story of Juan Sin Tierra is not only an excessive ambition lesson, but a warning. His insatiable yearning for wealth led him to betray his own brother, to destabilize the kingdom, and to sow discord among his subjects. Gold, which promised security and power, became its downfall. /prosody /speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. Remember that, despite its wealth, Juan did not achieve the stability or respect he sought. His actions left a deep mark of distrust and resentment in England, a legacy that affected later generations. The gold that could not codicited by the loyalty of his people, nor the inner peace that desperately longed for. The story of Juan Sin Tierra teaches us that true power does not reside in the accumulation of material wealth, but in wisdom, justice, and loyalty. His reign, marked by greed and betrayal, serves as a perfect example of how the unbridled search of gold can lead to ruin, both personal and for an entire kingdom. Have you stopped to think about the real price he paid for his ambition? I know you wonder, did you really sell your whole kingdom? Not quite. Juan Sin Tierra dilapidated his possessions gradually, committing territories and castles to get gold. It was not a unique and definitive sale, but a succession of desperate transactions that were leaving it more and more weak and vulnerable to their enemies. Think about it as a kind of slow and painful dismantling of its own power. And what happened to gold? Well, a part was destined to finance their military campaigns, although with disastrous results, as we saw. Another part disappeared, possibly in the hands of corrupt counselors or simply draved in unnecessary luxuries. In essence, the gold that I so longed for did not bring him the security or the power he sought, but quite the opposite. Many ask me about the long-term consequences. The loss of territories and the constant need for money led Juan without an almost perpetual conflict with their barons, weakening their authority and preparing the land for the signing of the Magna Carta, a document that, ironically, limited real power and laid the foundations for a more balanced political system, although it was not its intention. To deepen the life of Juan Sin Tierra and his disastrous financial decisions, I recommend you consult primary sources such as the Magna Carta, which directly reflects the impact of their actions on the kingdom. Although it does not tell the full story, the letter offers a valuable perspective on the economic pressures that Juan faced and how his financial problems affected his subjects. Find editions with translations and comments for better understanding. Among the secondary sources, you will find numerous biographies and historical studies that analyze the reign of Juan Sin Earth from different perspectives. Books like The Devil's Brood by Dan Jones offer an attractive and accessible narrative, while more specialized academic studies will provide you with a deeper analysis of the political and economic complexities of the time. Look for reviews and comparisons to choose the one that best suits your needs. Remember that history is a complex construction, and different authors can interpret the facts differently. Compare several sources will help you obtain a more complete vision and understand the different nuances of the history of Juan Sin Tierra. Do not limit yourself to a single source. Look for different perspectives to build your own understanding of the subject. And so the story of Juan without Earth ends. What do you think of your decisions? If you liked, like and subscribe for more stories of kings and kingdoms. What king would you like to analyze later? /prosody, /speak,